Well, hello, everyone. I'm so glad we've got like a large group. I wish I could see all of your lovely faces, but good morning. And we're going to be talking about building drought and flood resistant soils. So this is going to kind of, follow Stephen's talk very nicely. We set ourselves up well here. I'm just going to give you, because I'm a brand new assistant professor in agricultural water management here in the state and statewide extension specialist, an introduction to myself and my lab. We're going to talk a little bit about resilience. For those of you who are in this space and thinking about soil health and thinking about droughts and floods, this term gets tossed around a lot, but we don't talk about what it actually means. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about increasing drought resilience and also increasing flood resilience and focusing on a key practice here, which is going to be cover crops are going to kind of perk up and show up throughout this talk, just because I wanted to spotlight a practice. So a little bit about myself. I grew up in Minnesota, in Woodbury, for folks who know where that is. And I went to the University of Minnesota. I was a liberal arts person, actually. I just really like to read books. And I finished my undergrad and I worked as a pharmaceutical sales person for Pfizer for 5 years. As you can see already, I'm a talker, so that was a good fit for me. I fell in love with gardening and I decided to go back to school. And I at that point was in Wisconsin already at Pfizer. And I went to UW-Madison and studied soil science for a master's degree and then environment and natural resources for my PhD. And I focused my PhD work here in the Central Sands region, working with all of the irrigated agriculture there. And so I did a postdoc, still sticking with irrigated agriculture and sandy soils, but across the whole Midwest region. And then if you study irrigation, oftentimes you find yourself drawn out west. And that's what happened to me. I had a faculty position very similar to this one in agricultural water management out at UC Davis. So some of the research in my lab now is focused on almonds, or almonds as they call them out there, processing tomatoes, wine grapes, those types of crops in semi-arid or Mediterranean environments. But then, home was calling me, and this position, opened up here at UW-Madison, and I was so happy to move my lab back here. My lab is called the Conservation Irrigation Lab. But as what did I do here? Oh, here it is. Sorry, I lost my own slides. But as my students will say, we do more than just irrigation. So this is kind of some of the stuff we do. We focus on precision water management. So we map evapotranspiration or crop water use. We think about water stress a lot. We use drones, and we also map and are considering how to manage for heat waves, which can be, are becoming more and more intense. We focus on optimization of water use. So we're thinking about drainage, kind of thinking about conservation drainage, like Stephen had mentioned, tile drainage, working in irrigation scheduling and fertigation, which is becoming more popular. And then what I'm going to talk about today is the regenerative aspects of our lab. So the other parts of my lab are that hard engineered solution, right? That Stephen was saying is like, this is how we can solve these problems. We can irrigate more. We can install tile drainage. Like we do that. And I am into that. So if you are into that, please reach out to me. But today we're going to talk about kind of like a slower, softer solution. And that is this idea of regenerative agriculture or stacking soil management practices together, thinking about, or even like engaging in any soil management practices to think about drought and flood resilience as they relate to the physical health of your soil. So, kind of getting going on this, sticking with this theme of like weather whiplash, climate change does impact agriculture, and it's increasing this weather whiplash, right? So it's like, oh my goodness, what's happening? We had drought, now we have floods, like we're having this dry and wet combination switching back so quickly, and it's just hard to adjust to it. And even as scientists, we are trying to understand impacts, because they're also, some of these impacts are ones that we haven't studied before either. So as mentioned, like one way to handle this is to install irrigation and drainage, and sometimes even potentially both, right, on a field. So that is one way to handle it. But another way to handle it is something that we call ecological engineering. And this is how you could engineer the soil infrastructure of your system to become more drought and flood resilience. So an indirect approach for ecological engineering is trying to improve and increase management practices that are going to invite a more diverse microbial community and more soil biodiversity. And the reason that we would want to see that is because we would want to encourage the formation of organic matter. So this is an indirect approach, and it's called an indirect approach because it kind of takes a long time, right? We know that these types of practices, it may take some time for you to see impacts and to see results. What is becoming more popular here is this direct approach where there may be targeted addition of different types of soil amendments that could improve some of these soil structural properties that are related to drought and flood resilience. This is an area that we're still trying to understand, because I know that there are several types of amendments out there that maybe some of you are encountering. And this is an area too where, because there's like a sea of soil amendments, if you do happen to be using something, or if you're working with something and seeing results, like, please feel free to reach out. I want to hear about it. That's how we get our best research ideas, is from all of you. So what is a resilient soil? I don't know. If we were in person, I would say, raise your hand if you've seen this before. And most folks, I think, haven't encountered this, which is why I wanted to share it with you. And this is kind of how we think about resilience in systems theory. So we call this a ball and cup model. So you've got kind of this cup and this ball. And if you think of your soil as a system, there's going to be these shocks to the system. So a drought is a shock to the system. Flood is a shock to the system. And what a resilient soil does is it returns to its same state that it is in, this stable state of being in this cup. If it hits this shock, if it hits this threshold and it moves into a different state, that is not a resilient system. So like, we actually want our resilient systems to kind of spring back and return to their stable state. So that is the concept of ecological resilience. So when we say we want our farms to be resilient, that's what we're talking about. So let's talk about water. Let's talk about water storage. And folks who are in this space where they are irrigating may have seen this before. But one of the things I've been thinking about is that all of us are irrigating, right? Like, some of us have irrigation infrastructure in place to intentionally irrigate, but the rest of us are just relying on rainfall to show up at the right time and in the right amount. But that is still providing water, right? In essentially irrigating our soil. So it's important to kind of think about what water storage looks like in soil and understand this concept, whether or not you are irrigating. And so I'm going to show you this in a couple of different ways. First, like, if you think of your soil as a sponge and you have it saturated, it starts to drain because of gravity. So first, a soil is going to lose this part. It's gravitational water. And that's kind of at the top here. And then it's going to get to this place where if you have a sponge and you run it underwater, the gravitational drainage, it stops dripping, right? But it's still holding quite a bit of water. And that is the beginning of the water that's available for plants. And so we call that field capacity. So that's something that we call field capacity. And then at field capacity, crops are able to start using water. And in the irrigation world, we consider this the beginning of their tank, right? And so they have this tank of water, they start to use it. We call that the allowable depletion, until we hit a point where there's still water left in the tank, but it starts to get harder and harder for plant roots to access that water. So the plant water deficit begins at this point here, about halfway through that tank. And then you start to see, maybe a slowing of photosynthesis impacts, right? So for folks who are irrigating, they tend to initiate irrigation before that plant water deficit begins, because they don't want to get down to the bottom of this tank because there's actually impacts on photosynthesis at that point. So the lowest part of the tank here is the permanent wilting point. And that's kind of a sad place where at that point, there still is water in the soil, but it's unavailable because plant roots are not able to access it because the soil particles are holding that water too tight. So I also kind of want to show you this in this other way. This is more like a sponge type of visualization. That's a little bit closer of an approximation to what you see with a sponge. And we love thinking about the soil as a sponge. So at that saturation place, you start to, have this gravitational drainage. It's dripping. That's because of gravity. And then you hit field capacity, where that is the total amount of your plant available water. And I want you to remember that term, plant available water, because that is the term that we think of when we think about flood resilience. And then, plant roots are absorbing that water, and then you get to this wilting point, and look at this. You see these little layers of water that are surrounding these soil particles, and that's because there's still water in the soil, but it's just held on so tightly through the forces of adhesion and cohesion that plant roots can't extract that water anymore. So, I said plant roots can't extract that water, and I just want to show you this, which is the way in which we, in this space, we think of crops or plants in the irrigation world as a pump almost. And that's because the water moves from the lowest or most negative water potential, or highest suction to, from the water moves towards the highest suction here. So the water moves from where it's the under the least amount of suction to where it's the most amount of suction. So it goes from higher, which is less negative. This is very confusing. Students always have a tough time with this too. So less negative to more negative water potential is what we see. So water moves from the soil, which is about, on average, because I'm going to show you a lot of variability here, negative 44 PSI is an average, to, the roots, which is a little less negative, through the xylem, which is a little less negative, to the leaves, which is a little less negative, to the atmosphere. And so this is why we see this movement of water. And this is what we are watering for, right? Because the leaves lose water to the atmosphere because they have these pores that we call stomata. And the cost of doing business, if you are a leaf, is water. So leaves have to open up these stomata in order to access and take in carbon dioxide. And because of the difference in humidity between the soil and the atmosphere, when they open up their stomata, they lose water. So that's transpiration, and that's why plants need water. Plants do need to remain saturated, but majority of the water use by plants is this transpiration use. And this is where I said, I told you back here, right? Soil's negative 44 PSI, but here, no, there's a lot of variety actually. But generally speaking, it is more or less negative than the roots in order for it to move into the roots. So on this y-axis, we have water content by volume. And on the x-axis here, we have that water potential I was telling you about, that challenging concept. We call this the soil water characteristic curve, because this tells us about the relationship of water content and water potential in soils, and how tightly different types of soils are going to hold on to that water. And a lot of you, I think, know this kind of inherently, right? But here it is. Here's the physics of it. So a loamy sand, for example, it's going to see field capacity at negative 1.5 PSI. But then, it's going to be, field capacity is going to happen at a higher suction for a silt loam, and even a slightly higher suction for a clay loam, because the pores in those soils are smaller than the pores that are in this loamy sand. So they're going to be holding on to the water tighter. And so then we hit this allowable depletion point at negative 15 psi. So that's when that hits. And then permanent wilting point, which is, even above negative 150 psi. So that's when you hit that point where the soils are no longer willing to give up that water to the roots. And water content is decreasing right through this whole curve. And you can see that the water content for different soil textures when they hit these benchmarks is different. And this is, kind of getting back to how different types of soil textures have different water holding capacities or different amounts of plant available water. So what is a drought resilient soil? And this is another way that we think about resilience, is as a spring. If a drought hits, a drought resilient soil is going to be able to spring back is a way to think about this. So they maximize their tank size. They maximize this space between field capacity and permanent wilting point. How do they maximize it? How could we increase the size of a tank? Well, unfortunately, all of you, we're stuck with the soil texture that we have. That is a challenging thing to change. So if, there is some degree of drought resilience and flood resilience that is inherent because of the soil texture that you are farming on, right? So if you have a sandy loam or you're farming on a sand, you just have a smaller tank, right? Like you have less plant available water than if you are farming on a silt loam. So like you can only increase your tank size to a certain degree depending on the soil texture that you have. But the way in which you can do it is by adding organic matter to the soil. So when you add organic matter to the soil, the organic matter can actually change the porosity or add porosity to the soil. So how do you do this? Well, if you have about a 1% increase in organic matter, depending on your soil texture, you'll see some increase in the available water content or the plant available water. So let's look at this. If you have a loamy sand, this is 1 acre of soil and 1 foot of that acre. We call it an acre foot. So this is an acre foot. In an acre foot of a loamy sand, you have storage capacity. So this is your tank, 32,583 gallons of soil. With a 1% increase in organic matter, you get the most bang for your buck in this sand. So you would increase it, 3,666 gallons of storage, right? That would be increased because of this 1% organic increase or organic matter increase. Silt loam's still pretty good. 3,383 gallons, but whoa, look at this tank size. It's a much larger tank, right? So you're still having that increase, but man, in the sand, it actually makes a pretty big difference. However, I want to make a note. Those of you who may be farming in a loamy sand know that this 1% is much harder to come by. It's harder to get that increase in a sand. So getting the 1% increase in terms of what you are doing is not going to always be the same according to texture. So I also want to kind of share this study. This is out of Nebraska looking at cover crop implementation in corn systems. And what they found was that when organic matter content increases, there's an increase in field capacity. So that's the maximum, right, of your plant available water. But there's also an increase in permanent wilting point, right? So if you had the same amount of increase in field capacity and permanent wilting point, then your tank size isn't going to change. So when we implement these types of practices and hope to increase organic matter, the hope is that field capacity is going to increase more than the permanent wilting point. But I will say that this is something that, depending on the practice, depending on the location, depending on the soil type, we see some variability here. So how to increase water capture? So we've been talking about the tank size, but there's also this issue of when the rain comes, making sure that as much of the rain can be captured as possible. So that we call infiltrations. We want to infiltrate the rain that is available. And again, here you are stuck with the soil texture that you have. So if you happen to be farming on a sand, your infiltration rate, this is kind of a win, right? So your infiltration rate is going to be much higher and faster than if you are farming on a clay. And this cartoon comes from the irrigation space, because this is your little sprinkler, right? So we talk about this with folks who are irrigating, because we want them to set the rate of their irrigation systems to match the infiltration of the soil in order to actually have as efficient of irrigation as possible. Unfortunately, if you are depending on rainfall, you can't set the rate of your rain, but you can still maximize the infiltration. So again, getting back to how to do it, cover crops are kind of a great solution for increasing infiltration rate. This is a pandemic project that I worked on. So like myself and a group of folks, we did this study and we looked globally. So this is called a meta-analysis, or it's a study of studies. So we looked at all of the studies that we could find that implemented cover crops across the globe, across, different cropping systems, different soil types, and to see, are there universal responses to cover crops? And this is one of the universal responses, was increasing the infiltration rate. Across different soil types, we found that cover crops increase the infiltration rate. And the way that they do this is like there's kind of two mechanisms of action. The first one is faster. The first one happens because cover crops are introducing roots into the soil. Root channels are able to infiltrate water, right? That should hopefully be also kind of intuitive. So there's like this fast, cool first way. And then the second way is by, again, over time, adding organic matter. But I think because there's two ways in which they can potentially increase infiltration, that's one of the reasons why we saw this as a universal effect. All right, so how can we optimize drainage in soil? So this is getting to our flood resilience. Infiltration is also one of the ways to optimize flood resilience, right? Because if you have, a very large rain event happening, or an intense rain event happening, so, a lot of water in a little bit of time, having a high infiltration rate, or the highest you can have for your soil texture, is going to help you, right? It's going to help you with flood resilience. But again, we also want to kind of consider, how can we optimize drainage and water moving through the soil? And here is where I want to introduce a new, potentially, based on our in-person events this week, I'm going to say it's probably a new term for folks, and it's called saturated hydraulic conductivity. So if you haven't heard that term, just remember it, share it. It's Friday night. When you're eating your fish fry, drinking that old fashioned, be like, let me tell you about this term I learned today. It's called saturated hydraulic conductivity. And this is important for flood resilience. And what this is the ability of a soil to transmit water, right? So this is something we would like to optimize to improve our flood resilience. Again, this is kind of the name of the game here. You're stuck with the soil texture that you have. So here is a place, well, if you were farming on a sand and we were talking about increasing your tank size for flood resilience, it was like, we were stuck with a smaller tank inherently. But here, when it comes to floods, things are looking kind of good. If you're farming on a sand, you happen to just inherently have a higher saturated hydraulic conductivity rate. If you have a finer textured soil, you inherently have a lower saturated hydraulic conductivity rate. But still, you can still change this, right? You can still potentially change the structure of your soil. And this is getting back to that universal meta-analysis I shared, where we were like, what are the universal responses from cover cropping? This was one of the other universal responses that we found, was improving and increasing saturated hydraulic conductivity with cover crops. And it is because of that same reason of having two mechanisms of action with this particular soil management practice, where you're introducing additional roots and you're also improving and increasing the organic matter content. So again, across soil textures, we were able to see an increase in saturated hydraulic conductivity, generally speaking. Okay, I also want to mention this because this is something that we don't always think about, is what the groundwater subsidies or penalties may be based on the water table depth. of your agricultural fields. So if you have a water table depth that is higher and you're not, you don't have tile drainage in place, then you potentially are susceptible to oxygen stress in a wetter year and having, inherently lower flood resilience. If you have an optimal water table depth, then you potentially in a dry year could get some sort of a yield subsidy from that water table depth. And I'm in a silt loam kind of a soil. This could be at a depth at which the water at the water table is able to move vertically right through the soil pores, up the sponge, and become available for roots during dry periods. So there's almost like kind of two sources of irrigation here. There's the rain and there's this secret water table subsidy that you may or may not know about. And then similarly, if you don't have, if the water table is deep enough, there's no connection, then you're not getting that subsidy. And there's not really, but there's also not a penalty. So this is just something that I think is important to consider, to understand if you haven't done this yet or haven't ever thought about this before. This work done by Sam Zipper, this field is like, you can see it from 90 as you are driving through kind of the DeForest area. But because of the water table depth, there were parts of the field, and this was done, the study years were 2012 and 2013. So folks will remember dry year, wet year, right? There were parts of the field that were drought sensitive. There were parts that were consistently strong. There were parts that were flood sensitive, and there were parts that were consistently poor. And this is kind of related to the position of that water table depth. I want to end here by talking a little bit more about the meta-analysis that I mentioned. So we looked across the entire world, and several different parts of the world were represented, but obviously just because, we do a ton of research in the US was very well represented in this study. And I just want to point out, if I had a study that was just for Wisconsin about changes to drought and flood resilience from cover crops, I would show it to you. So as a new professor, I just want to share that this is an area where, we need more local data, and local data are important. And it's something that we are working on, and I am working on as I start my career here. So we did have representation across a variety of soil types as well in this meta-analysis. And we had representation across different cover crop types. So, legumes, grasses, non-legumes. And, general findings here, as I mentioned, related to the physics, this is our like cute plant summarizing what we found, is that there was this mean increase in saturated hydraulic conductivity and in infiltration rate. Like those are two pretty clear impacts of implementing cover crops that we found universally. What you don't see here on this cartoon is like a universal increase in that tank size or the plant available water content. And that's because we found mixed effects. In some cases, cover crops increase the field capacity and increase the permanent wilting point. So we didn't see an increase in the total tank size. It's that, that's something where that means it's very important to have localized data to understand, like, are there certain cover crops or mixes of cover crops that are going to be most beneficial for this? So this is an area in which I'm planning on doing more research here. I'm curious, and you can feel free to reach out to me directly, or if you want to bring it up during our panel here. What other practices are you folks using to improve your flood resilience? What are you considering? Like, what are you excited about? This is something I want to know. And something also we need to think about is, are there trade-offs, right? So there is already an inherent trade-off in your soil texture. So if you have a coarser soil texture, you are automatically more flood resilient and less drought resistant. And vice versa if you have a finer soil texture. So, but there may be other trade-offs that we need to consider with these practices. So that's another thing that I think we're all thinking about. So thank you so much for your time. Love to hear from you if you have comments or questions or ideas. I've got my contact information here. I'm on X and I'm also on LinkedIn. So yeah, thank you so much.